Welcome. Welcome. We're going to get started a little bit earlier tonight, so just a few announcements and things. So if you want to settle in and find a seat. This is the first year of the new social justice major. So this night's lecture with Tim Weiss, and thank you for joining us, is part of a lecture series. There have been 13 events that we've had this year, and this is one of our kickoff events. So just a little bit about the social justice and cultural studies major. We have 4 different vocational tracks, and we have a new track that's just come out on environmental justice. Then I have a few thank yous. So if you hear your name, please stand up. And I just want to kind of light a fire of appreciation at this point. Okay, so are you ready? Let's see how many people we can get to stand. I know not everyone could come. So first of all, just a thank you because I received an academic innovation grant. And so special thanks to David Ritter, Roland Moe, Dominic Williamson. Also a SERVE grant for the First Fridays with Margaret Brown. I want to thank the Dean of College of Arts and Humanities, Deborah Sequeira, if she can stand. Now, no, everyone has to stay standing. I'm so sorry. Sandy Mayo, Vice President of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. The ASSP Student President, standing right here. Okay, if there's anyone here who is an ASSP student leader or senator who voted to support this event tonight, so all senators and ASSP leaders, if you could rise. Anyone? ASSP! Woo! Where's ASSP? Stay standing, stay standing, stay standing.
Count it on.
All right. I could not do these series without the social justice student leaders. And so I want to give a special shout out to Andy Spilata. Are you here? Stand up. Okay, the Vice President, Taylor Petrucci. Are you here, Taylor? The Treasurer, Charlie Luhad-Zafner. Social Media Coordinator, Drew Cortez. And then all the leadership team, Darian, Rebecca, Emma, Elisa, Brenna, Cam, Levi, if you'll stand up. Woo! Okay. Now, the SJC majors all helped to make this happen tonight. So all SJC majors, can you rise?
Woo!
Now, one more thing. Dr. Bantam and I, we are teaching the Intro to Justice and the capstone on race, representation, and law, and we're the co-directors of this program, but this is a campus-wide major. We could not do it without every single department. If you're teaching a class in the social justice major, if you're a dean or a chair and you've signed off on one of these classes, please stand up.
Come on, y'all.
All right, now I know people have all sat down again, so one more time. Everyone I called, stand up. Everyone, everyone, everyone. This is a grassroots movement. This major is a grassroots movement. It's by a community that cares about social justice. This is what a Christian university looks like. When we care enough to understand the suffering around us, when we dare to love our neighbor as ourselves, when we fight against structural injustice, when we work together as an alternative community that protests injustice, when we all gather together here tonight, let's give us one more hand of applause.
Awesome. Thank you, Dr. Siegel. Awesome. I'm going to need everyone to keep this engagement up because this is only one of the only spaces where we get to have this conversation as a community. So we're going to stay engaged. Does that sound good? Okay, cool. With that being said, we do have everybody, when you chose a seat, there's a white note card with a golf pencil. So anytime that you have a question that comes up when Tim Weiss is speaking or someone else speaks, we have a question basket in the back. There's a very small sign over by the camera guy we got going back over there. Just drop that question off after Tim Weiss's discussion. After we make that transition. So go ahead and submit your question back there throughout the transition, and then we're gonna go ahead and have a faculty panel ask the questions that y'all put inside the basket. Does that sound good? Okay, cool. So I want to go ahead and introduce the president of the Social Justice Committee, Andy Spalletta, they, them pronouns. They're gonna go ahead and talk a little bit about the Instagram and also the debrief we have afterwards.
Hello, everybody. So I'd like to introduce these two projects we have going. So the first one is I would love to encourage everybody to follow our Instagram account. Whether or not you're in the major, whether or not you're a student on this campus, you should be updated on the events that we are having on our campus, because we'll be tackling controversial, sensitive, or just things that are important to the students, to the professors, to members of our community, and beyond. So the second thing I'd like to announce is the debrief event we'll be hosting next Tuesday, March 5th, from noon to 12:45. We will be having representatives from the Cultural Studies Committee and major members answering questions and continuing conversations that are brought up during this event. And I would like to thank everybody here for joining us again in this beautiful night. And I'd like to welcome on stage Dr. Brian Bantam, the Professor of Theology and Cultural Studies at SPU and co-director of the Social Justice and Cultural Studies major.
Good evening, everyone. It's so good to see you all and to see so many people here. And I just want, as long as we're offering thanks, I just want to give a shout out to Dr. Kim Siegel. She thanked everybody else in the world, but in so many ways, this major exists because of her energy, her passion, her amazing intellect, her ability to draw students into a vision and mobilize them and give them a sense of ownership over the project. So let's please all give Dr. Siegel a huge hand. It's my pleasure tonight to introduce our speaker, Tim Weiss. The reality is that from its very inception, America has been a construction of whiteness. It's built into the very sinews of its bones, of its structures. And so in a lot of ways, whiteness is not a new question, but it's always been a question of construction, of who counts, of who's in and who doesn't. And really only recently, we might say in the last 25 to 30 years, have white folk begun to ask a question of what does it mean to deconstruct this idea? Now, of course, people of color have been asking this question for a bit longer, but in a very critical way, the structures are so prevalent, so powerful, that until white people begin to ask themselves this question, who are we? And what is this thing, whiteness, that constitutes who we are? We really have no hope. And we are so thankful to have Tim Weiss here tonight, who is, in fact, one of the first to begin to critically ask this question, who's devoted his life in his writing and his work and his activism to helping white people to discover, to drill down and reimagine what their lives might be. In a Christian context, we might think of this as a sense of confession, right? We don't know what to confess, but until we are kind of made aware of it. And so I'm thankful for Mr. Weiss tonight that might help us to begin that process. He has written 7 different books. He lectures all over the world on questions of whiteness and racism. His 2 most recent books are Under the Affluence, Shaming the Poor, Praising the Rich, and Sacrificing the Future of America, and Dear White America, Letter to a New Minority. Again, he's been a tireless activist against white supremacy and for a new awakening among white Americans. But of course, we are also more than our books and our speeches. And so Tim is also father to Rachel and Ashton and the husband to Christy. We want to please join me in welcoming Tim Weiss to us tonight.
Thank you. Thank you. So with all the folks who got thanked a second ago and stood up, I don't know whether they were trying to make everyone feel good who was involved in this process or shame the rest of you for being so conspicuously absent from the planning of this event. But I'll thank you, even if you did not get a chance to stand before, for being here, because this is a good, really packed room, and I know some folks have gone to great trouble over the years. I've been talking to Deb about this for, I think, 37 years now. Not really, but at least 5 that we've been talking about making this happen. And I know sometimes it takes a minute, you know? Sometimes you wonder if people are trying to bring you to their campus for years and years and it doesn't quite happen yet. There's sort of 2 interpretations. One is they finally decided, well, you attained the age of 50, so perhaps you have calmed down enough that we can now bring you and it will be safe. Those of you who follow me on social media know that is not real. But the other possibility is that the moment is so important and the crisis is so real that they just get to a point where they're like, forget it, let's just bring him in. Let's just have the conversation, even if it's incredibly uncomfortable, because we really need to have the conversation. That, I think, is demonstrably true. And so I'm glad to be able to be here at this time and do my best to add to that conversation that I know many of you are already engaged in here and around this city on a regular basis. The topic, as you know, for today's talk, I saw it on the poster, so I know it's the topic. You know, I don't actually sometimes check in. I just know, like, I'm coming, I'm gonna do my thing, right? But then they have a topic, and I'm like, well, what's the topic? And Deb says, oh, here it is. And I said, oh, okay. So the topic is, what are we afraid of? The politics of fear in America. And I'm like, nah, I can work with that. Seems rational, seems logical. It is an honor to talk about that. Of course, when you ask the question, what are we afraid of? By definition, the first question you have to ask before you can answer that one is, who is we? And on the one hand, you know, we're all afraid of something, right? We all are. But I'm fairly confident I know who the we in this question is. And I certainly know who I'm gonna make it about, whether that was y'all's intention or not. We're gonna talk about what it is that white Americans in particular are afraid of, because we seem to be afraid of a lot nowadays. And like I said, it's okay. It's all right to be afraid. We're all afraid of something. I'm afraid of calculus because I never learned how to do it, so it's very intimidating. This is a thing, right? Afraid of lots of things. It's okay to be afraid. I say this as a professional hypochondriac, I should also point out. And when I say professional hypochondriac, I mean diagnosed. I'm not making light of it. Like diagnosed professional hypochondriac. Professional because some of y'all are amateurs, but I'm not impressed. Amateur folks who are hypochondriacs actually go to the doctor like every time they have a pain, right? That shows me you're an amateur. Professional hypochondriacs don't even go to the doctor because it's too late, right? We have a pain and we know it's over. Like there's not even a point in going. Like a few years ago, I literally had chest pains like 4 days in a row. I was convinced I was having a heart attack. I didn't tell my wife though, because why would I tell her? I'll just sit and suffer. 3 or 4 days in, I'm like, yeah, I think I'm in real trouble. I think I need to go to the hospital. She said, why don't you just go to the doctor? I said, oh, it's way past that. I end up going to the ER. $6,000 later, toward my still not met deductible, I found out I'd pulled a muscle. Thank you very much. This is what happens when you consult Dr. Google. You end up in the ER for a pulled muscle. My point of telling you this story is not just for the cheap laughs, though I appreciate them, and there will be more, I promise. The reason I'm telling you this story is it's analogous to the situation here, the point being that we as a society are afraid of things because we're misdiagnosing the source of our pain, we're misdiagnosing the source of our anxieties, And we have a lot of people who are more than willing to prey upon those insecurities and those anxieties and to make us afraid not of the pulled muscle, which it would have been nice to discover before the $6,000 bill came due, but rather afraid of the heart attack that we think we're having. And in a social sense, this is something we have a pretty big problem with. Amateurs diagnosing their own pain or turning to yet other amateurs, often with quite a bit of power and influence, who will diagnose it for them, but really don't know what they're talking about. And so a few years ago, I got what is really not a singular, but a rather ubiquitous type of email from a young man, well-intended, I'm sure, although it was all in capital letters in red font. So I knew that this young man was angry. That is the universal signal that I don't like you when I send you an email in all capital letters in red font, because God forbid you sent it to me in black font and took the cap lock off, I would not know by dint of your words that you hated me. And so this young man writes to me, big red letters, I can't find a job because all the jobs are going to blacks and Mexicans. I thought, really? All the jobs are going to blacks and Mexicans? That I find fascinating, because the Labor Department data that I had literally seen the day before the email came in told me that black and brown folks were roughly twice as likely as white folks to be unemployed, even when they had the same level of education. That is to say, African Americans with college degrees almost twice as likely as whites with college degrees to be out of work, even when they had the same major. Latinx folks with college degrees 50 to 60% more likely to be out of work than their white counterparts, even when they had the same major. Indigenous folks 2/3 more likely to be out of work than white folks, even when they had the same degree, same major. Asian American and Pacific Islanders 25% more likely than whites to be out of work, even with the same degree and the same major. So I'm not totally sure which people of color were taking this dude's job or where these jobs were. Maybe they were in Second Life. Maybe these jobs were digging ditches on Minecraft. But wherever they were apparently not in the real labor market. And yet, he was quite convinced of it, and he was afraid of it, because someone had convinced him that someone had taken his job. Just as a side note, and if you take nothing else away from this speech, that would be a shame, but if you take nothing else away from the speech, please write this down. When people say, you took my job, my question for you is this: did you have the job yet? Because if you didn't have it, it was not yours, right? Like, maybe I would be more sympathetic if the white guy got the call on Monday from the HR manager and they said, Bill, congratulations, you've been hired. And then Wednesday, the same HR manager called back and said, no, I'm just kidding. I'm giving the job to Jose, but thanks for playing. Like, that would be unfair. But that is not what is happening. But we have people like this young man, right, who are convinced that his pain, his unemployment, which is quite real, I guess. I mean, he could be lying. But I'll take him at his word, because there are millions of white people just like himself, unable to find work, still haven't really recovered from the recession. The pain is real, just like the pain in my chest was real. And my wife, God love her, 20 years in, knows not to be so cruel as to question my pain. She did not look at me and say, Tim, you have lost your mind. It is all in your head. You are not in pain. She acknowledged it. She just wanted me to get a proper diagnosis, and not the one that I could find on some chat board, right? But this young man has been told that his pain is the result of those people, and so that's why he is afraid. But it's not the only fear, right? It's not the only fear that people have. There are other fears that politicians, so-called leaders, will stoke for the sake of political gain. We have a president who, on the campaign trail, for instance, gave a speech in which he said to black people, though he said it in front of white people, which is fascinating, right? Went to Milwaukee, but not really Milwaukee. He went to a white suburb of Milwaukee and gave a talk, supposedly to black people, in a room full of white people about black people. And what he said is, you all can't even leave your house without getting shot. Again, I don't know who the you all is. I doubt it is the white folks of Pewaukee outside of the city, right? But he says, this is the problem. We're living in American carnage. You people can't even walk out your door without getting shot, stoking fear of what? Crime. But to whom was he speaking? right? Was he speaking out of real conviction and concern for black safety? Well, he's not speaking to black people, so I sort of doubt it. He's speaking in a room full of white people. The purpose of that speech is not to show sympathy or solidarity with black people, but to remind white people of just how dangerous black people are. That's why he did it. And it wasn't even true. It was about stoking fake fear, because contrary to the president's rhetoric and contrary to the beliefs of millions of people, crime is not up, crime is down, not just by a little bit, but by a lot. In fact, violent crime is down by 2/3 since the early 1990s. Across the board, in white neighborhoods, in black neighborhoods, Milwaukee, safer today than in 1991. Chicago, safer today than in 1991. Washington, D.C., safer today than in 1965. New York City, safer today than in 1972. In fact, the black male homicide rate is lower today than it was in 1950. And yet we have fools running governments and media talking heads who want you to believe, because it feeds their political power and feeds your fear, which feeds their power, that things have gone off the rails, that the country's getting more dangerous, that black people are killing one another in record numbers, or maybe even killing white people in record numbers, neither of which are true. But why do they lie? See, the data's there. It's very clear. It's Department of Justice, it's FBI, it's the Bureau of Justice Statistics. And this is not opinion, by the way. This is not like, there's no rebuttal to what I'm saying. So don't even try Googling it. Like, there's no rebuttal to what I'm saying. It's factual, and yet we have people who are convinced that America's more dangerous than ever. But there is less crime today than when many of your parents were in college. They may not believe that. Same thing with K-12 schools, right? We act like schools have become cesspools of violence because we have politicians and we have media talking heads who make it seem that way. Oh my goodness, the young people are out of control. Of course, every generation has said that about young people, right? You can actually go back to the 1930s and you can find statements made by media talking heads even then, and by commentators and by politicians and by parents of children, that the kids in high school were ruffians and thugs and out of control, horrible people, the worst generation ever. Of course, now we remember these young people as the so-called greatest generation who won World War II. But at the time, we looked at them as thugs and ruffians and ne'er-do-wells, because every generation, that's the same shtick that we push and that we pump, even when it's not true. Schools are safer today than they were 30 years ago and 40 years ago. Acts of violent crime, acts of property crime down across the board in urban schools, in suburban schools, in small town schools, in rural schools. That's just a fact. But we have people who profit off fear, and particularly the fear of what? Racial others, economic others, right? National others, religious others. Or we're told what? That there are people coming over the border to kill us, to harm us, to reap chaos in our country, ignoring, of course, the fact that violent and property crime rates are lower among undocumented people than they are among citizens of the United States, ignoring the fact that undocumented border crossings are actually down by 2/3 since the year 2000, which is to say there is no national emergency today if the border crossings are down and if crime is down. Oh, and by the way, neighborhoods and communities with larger percentages of undocumented people actually have lower crime rates than neighborhoods and communities with less of a population of undocumented people. If all of that is true, and it is, then the whole idea of a national emergency is about stoking fear. It's not about actually addressing problems. 40% of all the people in this country who are quote unquote undocumented or quote unquote illegal didn't even cross a border illegally. They came legally on a work visa or an education visa, overstayed that visa. So building a wall isn't going to stop them, right? Shutting down the border isn't going to stop them, but a disproportionate number of those folks are from places like Canada, so. Where we also don't construct a wall. Isn't that fascinating? We're apparently only worried, only afraid, only in fear about people at this border, never this border, only this border, never this border. Apparently, we are not concerned about crafty Canadians sneaking into the United States to take advantage of our superior healthcare system. Which would be weird if they were to do that. That's why Senator Rand Paul right? When he had to have hernia surgery, he didn't go to Kentucky, where he's from, didn't go to Lexington, right? Went to Canada. But we're number one, just remember. I got about 40 more minutes of this, so y'all hang tight. So we're being told to be afraid of these things, even when these things are not really the source of the harm, the pain. The pain is real, and we ought not minimize that, and we ought to try to really address it. But if you're going to try to address pain without properly diagnosing its source, you're never really going to solve the problem, right? I mean, this is just sort of common sense. So it isn't compassionate to speak to people's pain in a way that isn't accurate. That's not compassion, right? You have to speak to it in a way that is accurate, and you have to insist on a proper diagnosis. But what makes it so easy for people to fall into these traps? Because I think most people are good people. Now, I could be wrong. I could be. But at the age of 50 and with a 17 and a 15-year-old daughter, I have a vested interest in believing that people are generally good, right? And if you know otherwise, please don't tell me. I'd rather stay in this bubble of naivete and faux innocence for a minute. So I like to believe that people are basically good, but of course good people, right, can get sucked into bad systems of operation, bad institutions and structures, and bad systems of thought, right, that sort of take our otherwise goodness and our, good, positive, compassionate, caring tendencies and distort them or twist them or, shift them and twist them in some way that steers us away from our better selves. So even though I think people are good, we can fall into these patterns of thought and behavior. And I would contend that there are two things really that make it possible, not just possible, but actually sort of predictable, that millions of Americans will fall into these patterns of fear and misdiagnosis of pain, right, in such a way that it's not at all surprising. Now, I'm not saying this to let people off the hook when they fall into those patterns. I think we have to be held accountable for the things we do. But at the same time, I think that if you fall into patterns, if you fall into traps that were set for you, right, traps that were set for you by the culture, it's not enough to just judge you for that, right? I have to judge the culture for that, right? It's like when you go shopping, right? When you go to the grocery, what do they tell you to do? Never go to the grocery what? Right, see, everybody knows, and yet what do we all do? We go to the grocery when we are hungry because we are hungry, and that's where there's food, right? So we go to the grocery and we're hungry, and what do you know? There's always candy at the checkout aisle. Now, does anyone in this room think that that is a coincidence? Does anyone in this room think, for instance, that the purchasing manager at the grocery store just keeps ordering too much candy and can't figure out, my God, I keep doing this. I keep ordering more candy than the actual candy aisle will hold. What in the world shall we do with the surplus? Oh, I don't know, Jim. Let's just put it at the checkout. We got nowhere else to put it. It's not a coincidence. It's because it's an understood trap, right? Because the people that make money selling you stuff know that if they put candy at the checkout and the National Enquirer and the People magazine and the beef jerky or whatever else it is that you don't really need, don't really want, but always buy, that you will purchase it. Because that's impulse purchasing. It's a trap, and we all fall for it, at least sometimes. Not all the time, right? Sometimes we're real smart and we eat before we go, and we're like, I'm not buying the candy today, right? But next time, you're going to buy the candy, right? And they know it. So can I judge you for it? Yeah, I can judge myself for it. But the real question is the culture that's setting the trap of consumerism, of materialism, of impulse purchasing, or in the case of racial bias, gender bias, class bias, all these other types of biases and prejudices, the traps of those, right, which are being set by the culture. So I think there are two forces that make it really easy and even predictable for people to fall into these traps. The first is an absolutely pathetic historical memory. We are the most ahistorical people on earth, right? And this is funny for a people that so love history, but only a certain version of it. Because white folks do love the past, y'all. Like, you do know that, right? Like, we like history. We like the past. Like, the past, we like it. We just like the past that makes us feel good, right? The past that makes us feel special. The past that allows us to have a little cute little hat with the slogan, Make America Great Again. Because you remember it was great. You remember when America was great, right? Don't know for whom, but when it was awesome, until it went off the rails with that black guy who became president. Everything was cool right up until that, apparently, right? So we love the past when it makes us feel good. Now, we don't necessarily like it when people of color bring up the past, though. Right? I was at University of Mississippi the other night, and the day before I got there was a big neo-Confederate rally, because Mississippi. And these good old boys are out there with their gray uniforms on, because their great-great-great-granddaddy Beauregard left it to them. And they're out there rallying with the Confederate flag and unironically telling black people to get over slavery. Now, see, here's the problem. When you tell black folks to get past the past and you're marching around waving a flag of a government that lost and lost badly 150 years ago, wearing gray uniforms of a defeated army, you do not obviously understand the definition of irony, because you are a walking, talking piece of evidence of the thing. We don't like that past. We just like the past that venerates great-great-great-grandpappy Beauregard, not the one that brings him up a little short. So we have a horrible historical memory. We pick and choose, and we all do it. We do it in our own lives. I mean, let's just all admit it, right? We pick and choose the history of our own families that we want to recall. We want to hold up the good. We don't want to take the bad. We don't want to look at it too long. I get it. Like, it's understandable. It's a natural human instinct. The problem is when entire cultures do that, it makes it impossible to move forward and create justice, because you're not accurately recollecting how you got into the period of injustice. You're not actually reflecting and accurately understanding how you got from point A to B. And if you don't know how you got here, you're not going to figure out how to get over there to point C, right? Or D or E or F or whatever it is. So we have a horrible historical memory. That's why people can wear that hat and the MAGA gear unironically, because they actually are able to believe, because of their identity, that America was once great. But for whom was it great? I mean, it ought not be radical at all to suggest that America was never great for black people. That ought not be a radical statement. It is obvious, it is true, it is irrefutable, there is no rebuttal to it. America was never great for peoples of color. America was never great for women as women. Like, until 1971 or 2, when the Equal Credit Opportunity Act was passed, women, including white women, couldn't even get their own lines of credit from banks unless their daddy or their husband took out the credit line for them. That's within my lifetime and the lifetimes of many people in this room. So when was America great for women as women? Please pray tell. When was it great for LGBTQ folk? When was it great for religious minorities? When was it great for the poor of any race? You think America was great for those poor white kids that worked in coal mines in 1911 and 12 at the age of 14? It wasn't great for them either. The only people for whom America was ever great were the ones who ran it. Rich, white, straight, at least claiming to be straight men. Right? It wasn't even great for all of them, right? But great enough that now they want to make it great again, like that. That's historical memory being blinkered and ridiculous and absurd. Right? But you don't have to know any better. You don't have to know that. And when you even say that, people go, that's un-American. You're un-American for saying that. No, I'm just accurate. I'm just telling the truth. I'm just not really into lying, because that's what we do as a country. We tell lies about history because it makes us feel better. Like, what did George Washington do when he was a kid? Y'all remember, right? What'd he do? Chop down a cherry tree, and then what'd he do? Told his daddy, because he couldn't tell a lie. Do anybody still believe that story? That did not happen, y'all. First of all, even if it did happen, how would anybody know that happened? Like, when George Washington was 8, nobody knew he was going to be that George Washington. So nobody was paying attention to his 8-year-old self, thinking, oh, now that kid told his daddy about the cherry tree. We better write that down just in case he becomes president one day and we need to hold him up as a particularly honest individual. It was just a lie that we told because we wanted George Washington to be this superhero. And people might say, well, that's sort of, you're nitpicking, and what's the point of that? The point is, why did we tell the lie? See, why don't we just tell the truth about our history? Well, because if we tell the truth, then it complicates our narrative about the present, and it complicates what our obligations are in the present to try to create justice and to undo some of the damage, perhaps, of that past. And it means that we can't continue to be afraid of the stuff that some folks want us to be afraid of, because now we're seeing things more clearly. So we just settle for the inaccurate, absurd, blinkered historical memory. It's one of the reasons that there's so much pushback against the movement for Black lives that has emerged over the last several years in the wake of disproportionate police violence and brutality against Black bodies, right? Because when Black folks stand up and insist that Black lives matter, if you have an accurate historical memory, that will not shock you at all. It will not seem troublesome. It will not seem weird, right? But if you don't have an accurate understanding of history, then that will seem odd to you, and you'll say things like, well, but what about my life? What about white lives? White lives matter. Don't white lives matter? All lives matter. I know, precious. Oh, I know. I already told y'all, I got a 17-year-old daughter, 15-year-old white daughter. They are white. They're both white. That's what happens when white people make babies. You get white children. I got 2 of them. And I know their lives matter. I know their lives. You have to tell me that their lives matter. You don't need to let me know that. Here's the thing, though. See, the problem is everybody knows their lives matter. The cops all know it. The employers all know it. The teachers all know it. The loan officer at the bank, when they go get a mortgage one day, they're all going to know it. Nobody questions it. And see, that's the point. You don't have to specify what gets taken for granted. So you don't have to say white lives matter. You don't have to say all lives matter. You have to specify that which gets left out. And if you understand history, you know that specifically Black life has been devalued. That's why we must now claim it. That's why we have Black History Month, not White History Month, because we got a bunch of them. They just go by these tricky names we gave them, like May and June and July and August. All these names that we gave them just so folks wouldn't figure out that's what we were really doing, was white history. Now we're in Women's History Month. You don't need a Men's History Month, y'all. You got 11 of them. Right? You don't have to specify that which gets left out. And if you understand history, that won't shock you. Plus, you'd also understand that America has a long history of saying all and not meaning it. That's why all lives matter is not a comeback. It's not a rebuttal. It's absurdity. Right? We have a long history of saying all and leaving out certain people. Thomas Jefferson, right, said what? All men are created equal, endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights, among those life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. But when he wrote those pretty words, he owned about 237 human beings, as I recall, so I'm figuring he didn't believe his own rhetoric. But it was pretty rhetoric. He just didn't really mean it, right? And then when the Pledge of Allegiance got written in the 1880s, it was redone in the 20s, it was redone again in the 1950s, but every iteration has ended with the same words. What are those words? With liberty and justice for all. There's that word again, all, but they didn't mean it. They didn't mean it in the 1880s. They didn't mean it in the 1920s, and they certainly didn't mean it in the 50s. So until all actually includes all, white folks are just going to have to back off and let Black folks say Black, and we need to say it with them. You understand? That's the reality of the situation. You have to specify that which has been left out. But again, if you don't have a clear understanding of the history of law enforcement in Black communities, all of that will seem radical to you. Whereas if you do have that understanding, it won't seem radical at all. It'll just seem banal and obvious, right? Because at least, see, here's the thing, Black folks know some of this history because they've lived it. So Black folks know that policing traces directly to what? Slave patrols. That's the first iteration of law enforcement in this country that they experienced. And they know that it was law enforcement that enforced the slave codes, and it was law enforcement that enforced segregation. It was cops and jailers, members of law enforcement, that opened up the jail cells and let Black folks out into the hands of the mob to string them up from trees, right? It was police who enforced segregation. It was police that pulled those protesters off of the stools at the Woolworths in Greensboro and Nashville and all throughout the South. It wasn't just random white folks. It was white folks with badges and guns and the power of the state. That doesn't mean all cops are bigots. It doesn't mean all cops are racist. It doesn't mean all cops are brutal. It means that the history of policing with Black folks is a little different than the history that many of the rest of us have experienced. Because for African Americans, police were not the folks who came and got your cat out the tree. They were not the folks who came and gave little Johnny a ride around in the neighborhood just to show him how gosh darn exciting it was to be a policeman. That's not the history of law enforcement in Black space, right? They know that it was law enforcement and is law enforcement that enforces the war on drugs, which I beg to remind you was never a war on drugs. We know it was not a war on drugs, is not a war on drugs, because it's not drugs being targeted, it's certain people being targeted, specifically black and brown people, because the data tells us what? That white folks use drugs, possess drugs, and sell drugs at the same or higher rates than people of color do, contrary to popular belief, and yet we know that black and brown folks are 4 to 5 times more likely to be arrested for weed, for instance, and prosecuted for it and sent to prison. We know we live in a country and you live in a state where you got lots of white folks becoming weed millionaires, while black folks are still sitting in prison, brown folks still sitting in prison for selling the same product, just didn't have enough money to get an occupational license and a storefront. So they're doing time and other folks are getting rich selling weed that comes with tasting notes, y'all. For real? Tasting notes with weed. Like, you can get your weed in 37 different flavors. Apricot. Y'all want peppermint chocolate chip? We got that. White people have gentrified weed, y'all. I don't need to know what to pair my weed with. The rules of weed say you just pair it with Cheetos. That's what you pair weed with. And I'm not advocating weed, by the way, I gave that up a long time ago. I have asthma, so. And y'all heard at the introduction, this was about the confessional mode, so I'm confessing my sins in a place of God. It's appropriate. It's appropriate. The data tells us the war on drugs was not about drugs. Black and brown folks know that it's not about drugs, right? So they have a different attitude about law enforcement, and that's understandable, isn't it? It makes sense, right? If you understand history, if you understand the contemporary reality, then this movement isn't odd, it isn't weird, it's logical, it's rational. But if you don't have that sense of history, then it becomes very easy to miss this. Same thing with immigration, right? So you think about why we respond the way we do to people coming over that southern border, right? And white Americans will say things like, well, I don't mind if they come. I just want them to come the right way, legally, like my ancestors did. Oh, for real? All right, let's talk about your ancestors then. Right? For real? Legally, like your ancestors, like mine, legally, like our people did. Let's talk about that. First of all, there was no law to break, y'all. Right? So when your great-great-grandparents don't break a law that wasn't even on the books yet, so they couldn't even have come illegally had they wanted to, the fact that they then came legally does not get them any bonus points. You don't get patted on the back for not breaking a law that didn't exist. Right? And I'm quite confident that had indigenous people known what was going to happen, they would have passed some immigration laws and we would have broken them. You actually think we wouldn't have broken them? Like, you think if native people had passed really hard immigration laws to keep us out, that we'd have been like, well, we're starving in England, but wouldn't want to break the laws of the nations of the Americas, wouldn't want to break those anti-immigration, wouldn't want to do anything illegal. We'll just stay here in England and starve to death. But it was nice while it lasted. It was a nice dream. No, we would have crossed the border. We would have crossed the ocean. We would have come irrespective of the laws because we were striving for the same thing that all migrants strive for, life and opportunity and liberty and all of that. But see, that's also part of the history that we don't want to admit because we have this blinkered notion of history as white Americans. See, black folks know how they got here. That's why I'm putting it on white. Like, black folks know how they got here. And Asian Americans, many of them know, especially if they're of Chinese descent, that many of their ancestors were brought here to build the railroads, right? And, I mean, Latinx folks, particularly Chicano folks, they know they were here first, right? We stole half of their country in a war of aggression that we started on false pretense. They know that, even if we don't. Indigenous people know how they got here, but we've been telling lies for a really long time. So one of the lies that we tell is, our people came for freedom, high-minded principle, liberty. But those people, they're just coming for stuff. No, everybody came for stuff, y'all. Everybody came for, we didn't come for free. First of all, if we had come for liberty, we would have established it. But we did not. And I don't just mean for black folks and brown folks, that goes without saying. We didn't establish liberty for other European people. right? I mean, the colonies were like some of the most unfree places on the planet at that time. Like the history of the American colonies is pretty much about oppressing black folks, stealing indigenous land, and looking for the witch, right? It's pretty much what then when we found her, we killed her because she wasn't praying the right way, right? That's not liberty, that's not freedom. That's horrible oppression and tyranny. But we act like we had these high-minded principles, and we act like we came here, right, with skills and clean fingernails, right? And then we get angry at these low-skilled labor. They don't even speak the language. They're all low-skilled. Like we came over here reading Chaucer and contemplating complex mathematical equations. Have y'all read Dickens? Like, do you know whence we come? Like, you know, so when the president calls African nations S-hole nations, right? Have you read Tale of Two Cities? Right? Do you realize that the original S-hole nations were our countries? We've written about them, but we act like that's not true. Oh no, we all came from glistening gold, you know, highways and big buildings and advanced technology, right? We're better than those people, but we came for the same reasons, desperation, that they're coming, right? We act like we were better, but the fact is our people were the losers of Europe. That's the historical truth. And I'm not saying that to be mean or hyperbolic. It's just true. Again, it's inarguable. You know how I know? Because the winners don't leave, y'all. The winners don't leave. The winners don't get on the boat. Why would you get on the boat if you were winning? If you were winning, you would not get on the boat. If you were winning, you would stay right where you're at because you're winning. Why in the world would some English person in 1647 gather his family around the fireplace at the castle down from the king's place and say, all right, children, I've been talking to your mum about this, not much, because after all, I needn't talk to her at all. It's 1647 and her opinion doesn't really matter. But we've been having this conversation and we've come to the conclusion that 2 weeks from tomorrow, pack your bags because we're gonna get on a big ship, a huge boat. I don't even know if it's seaworthy. We might capsize, we might be eaten by sharks, we might be kidnapped by pirates, we might die of scurvy, but I think that if we survive the journey, you will agree a year hence that it was a fantastic journey. All right, that didn't happen. The winners didn't get on the boat, which is why it's so funny when white folks get on Ancestry.com looking for some royalty in our families, right? Looking for the kings and queens. Where are they? Where? Oh my God. Well, there's my great whatever came over on the Mayflower. All right, here's the deal. If you actually knew who was on the Mayflower, and who was on those early ships, you might not brag so much. You think those were the winners? The winners didn't leave, y'all. You know who was not on those boats? The king. The king was not on those boats. Nobody the king particularly wanted to keep around was on those boats. Those boats were filled with the losers of Europe who could not make it. And you know what? There's no shame in any of that. I'm not saying that to be cruel. There is no shame in being the loser. And you know what? More than that, there's something truly beautiful about being the loser and saying, you know what? I'm done with losing, and I'm going to pick up, and I'm going to start over, and I'm going to make a better life for my family. But just as beautiful as that is when Europeans do it, it is every bit as beautiful when Africans do it, and Latin Americans do it, and Asians do it, and people all over the world do it. It is no different when they do it. But because we don't know our history, we don't see it. And finally, just the very way in which these political fears get stoked is a long-standing process. After the presidential election in 2016, there were a lot of commentators, right, who said things like, this is not normal. This is not the America we know. These commentators, I beg to remind you, were very white. Because for black and brown folks, nothing about that election was especially shocking. I know that white folks found that, how could this happen? How in the world could what happen? A rich white man get elected by telling not rich white people that their enemies are black and brown? You think that's new? That's like the oldest play in the playbook. That's like on page 1 of the playbook of American politics going all the way back to the colonies. There's literally no play that came before that one. That's just the one that they ran over and over and over again like a forward pass. It's just like, I don't know, let's run that one again. It seems to work. The first time it was used was in the colonial period when white people didn't even exist. And I know that sounds strange. What do you mean, Tim? White people didn't exist. Yes, we didn't. Not at least called that. We weren't called white. in our countries of origin. You think Europeans are one big happy family? No, of course not. We spent most of our history killing each other and looking for the witch, but killing each other. Right? The English hated the Irish hated the English, everybody hated the Germans, not without reason. Northern Italians didn't even think Southern Italians were Italian, right? There was all this intra-group squabbling and hatred. It wasn't one big happy team called white people, but all of a sudden in the 17th century, in the colonies of what became the United States, there became a need to create this category. Why? What happened? Like, did they come up with some fossil discovery that showed some scientific connection between all European peoples? No. Was there some linguistic discovery, some Dead Sea Scroll that showed that all European people were linguistically connected? No. The one thing that happened, the only thing that happened that necessitated the creation of white people, right, was that rich people can count pretty good. And the rich folks in the colonies that owned all the land looked around and they counted it up and they realized what? That they were heavily outnumbered by whom? They were outnumbered by African enslaved people and European indentured servants who were just one level above slaves themselves, and they figured eventually that those folks were going to rise up and take their stuff because they were going to realize they were all getting messed over by the elite. And sometimes there were rebellions. Bacon's rebellion in 1676 would be one example, not the only one, where folks across lines of color and continent, poor people, now called white, poor people called black, got together to overthrow aristocratic arrangements, and so now you had to create this category of whiteness to tell those poor peasant class Europeans that they're on the team with the rich, see? Because otherwise, if you don't divide them and conquer them, they may take your stuff. And so they start doing what? They start giving them a few rights, let them testify in court, let them enter into contracts, they get rid of indentured servitude in the early years of the 1700s altogether, right? They start putting poor white people on the slave patrol to keep those black folks in line. We're going to give you a gun and a badge and a horse. And white folks were like, a horse? All right then. Still don't own any land, hardly own the shirt on my back, definitely don't own any enslaved persons, but now you gave me a little taste of power, didn't you? You gave me a little taste of authority. Not real power, not real authority. That still resides in the hands of the rich, which I am decidedly not. But you gave me a taste of it, what W.E.B. Du Bois would later call what? The psychological wage of whiteness. The idea that I might not have much, but at least I'm not black. Later on, I might not have much, but at least I'm not Chinese labor on those railroads. I might not have much, but at least I'm not Latinx. I might not have much, but I'm not indigenous, and that makes me superior to you, right? That was a trick. Rich white people telling not rich white people that their enemies were black and brown, and it worked. And those rebellions slowed and then stopped, and this new team was created. Divide and conquer isn't new. And if you know your history, you're not thrown off stride by it. You realize it's the same thing that's been happening for hundreds of years. During the Civil War era, the same thing happened, right? The rich in the South, we announced, I say we, not because I'm rich, but because I am a Southerner, my people announced why they were seceding. They weren't shy about it, and we didn't lie about it. We lie about it now. And we say things like, oh, it wasn't about racism and slavery. It was about states' rights. What right do you think they wanted states to have? Was it the right to determine the proper recipe for a mint julep? Was it the right to determine the proper way to smoke a pork butt? No, it was the right of people in said states to continue to own other human beings as chattel property. That was the only reason they ever gave, right? They didn't talk about trade and tariffs and economic policy and big central government. They talked about the desire to maintain enslavement of African peoples, which they were committed to, and the maintenance of white supremacy, which is something that the vice president of the Confederacy, Alexander Stephens, said was the cornerstone of the Confederate government. But here's the trick. Rich people don't go to war, right? So the rich folks get the poor folks to go fight for them, right? Rich people don't go to war. You know this, right? Rich people get doctors to write phony notes saying they have heel spurs so they don't have to go to war. That's what rich people do. They get poor people to fight their battles for them, but that's a weird thing. It's hard, right? Because if I'm rich, how do I convince you who are poor to go fight for my property, right? My slave, so I can keep my slave. Because you don't own any, right? You're not directly benefiting, in the way I am at least, from that slave economy. So how do I get you to do that? I mean, that's weird. Like, I got a nice house, y'all. And even those of you that really like this speech, I'm fairly confident that if an invading army takes over Nashville in like a month, I can't call any of you and be like, hey, you like my speech, right? Cool. Okay. So there's this army coming down the street. I think they're going to take my house. I don't feel like fighting, but I'd really appreciate it if you would come and defend my house for me. You'd be like, yeah, like the speech. Good luck with that. Bye. Like, you would not come and fight for me. But in the South, poor folks, oh, we'll do it. Oh. Why? Why? Because the rich went to them and said, if these people get free, if these people get free, if these people get free, they're going to take your job. No, fool. They already have your job. That is the point. If you got to charge $1 a day to work on the farm, and the guy that owns the plantation can get the black dude to do it for free because he owns them, guess who got the job? Free got the job, Jack, not you. So as a matter of fact, poor white people would have been better off joining with poor black people to overthrow these rich white folks, take all their stuff, jack all their property, and create a new system. But you made them afraid, see? You created the fear that they are the enemy. Rich white people telling not rich white people that their enemies are black and brown. Same thing going on today with immigration. If we can just build that wall, the jobs will come back. For real, is that how you think capitalism works? For real, is that how you think capitalism works? You just build a wall, and then all the bosses of America are like, oh, they figured it out. We were going to keep taking advantage of them, but they figured it out. They built the wall. Now I got to give everybody a raise. It's not how it works. The wall doesn't stop the capitalists from sending the money overseas. It doesn't stop the owner from building the plant in Sri Lanka. The wall does not exist in cyberspace and stop the transfer of money into Cayman Island bank accounts, right? Capital will always be moving. Goods will always be moving. If you allow capital to move in search of the highest rate of return, and you allow goods to move in search of the highest price, but you don't allow labor to move in search of the highest wages, guess what? You have tilted the game permanently against workers and in favor of capital. That is basic Econ 101. It is not complicated, and it is not arguable, and yet these folks are afraid that if they don't build the wall, their opportunities will diminish, when in fact, working people on both sides of that line and on all sides of all borders would be better off with labor mobility, allowing the working class to increase in its militancy and its demands for better labor conditions, better wages, better benefits all across the continent and all across the world. But see, we've been made afraid of the other, and we don't know our history, and so we ignore that. There's one more thing that makes this possible, though, this trap that we fall into. It's not just the historical memory being faulty, it's the very ideological cornerstone of American life. And this is where it gets tricky, right? Because there's one thing, see, that we've all been taught. All of us, regardless of race or gender, sexuality, region of the country from which we come, socioeconomic condition, whatever our identities are that are different. We got a lot of people with different backgrounds in this room, but the one thing that we've all been taught, either by parents, or if not by parents, by teachers, if not teachers, by preachers, if not preachers, by politicians, if not them, then by the ethos of the country, is the American ideal, right? The secular gospel of this country. Genesis 1:1 in the Bible of Americanism. And what is it? You know what it is. We all know, right? It's the idea that anybody can make it in America. If you just work hard enough, anybody can make it, right? And if you didn't make it, it's your own fault. And if you did make it, it's because you're better, and if you didn't, you ought to work harder. And here's the problem with that. First of all, we all know people who have worked hard their whole lives and have nothing. So at some level, we know it's not that easy, right? And we all know people, or at least most of us do, right, who were born on third base but think they hit a triple, and they never actually had to work particularly hard an entire day in their lives. I'm told there are even some people who were earning $200,000 a year at the age of 3 in the early 1950s, and were a millionaire by the age of 8, and ultimately ended up getting about $400 million worth of real estate in a portfolio from their father, and then wants you to believe that he happens to be a self-made billionaire. I'm told that this happens. I don't know if this is true, and I'm not sure who I'm speaking of, but I'm sure you can Google that later on tonight. We all know that it's not as simple as wherever you end up is all about your efforts. We all know that. We all know it, but we want to believe it, don't we? Because it makes us feel that we're the captains of our ship. So I get it. We want to incentivize effort, so we want to say it. We want children to believe in themselves. But here's the problem. If I tell you that where you end up is all about your effort, And then you look around and you see massive disparities, especially disparities that track things like color, right? So that disproportionately it's white folks up here, and disproportionately it's people of color down here, and disproportionately it's men up here, and disproportionately it's women down here, and of course just the rich versus the poor on a socioeconomic level. What happens? Racism, sexism, and classism become logical conclusions. They become default positions, because I told you that wherever you end up is about your effort. And that means the people down here, well, they just must not want it as much. See, that's the logical conclusion if you believe that uncritically. If you don't interrogate Genesis 1:1 of the Bible of American ideology, which we are not, I beg to remind you, encouraged to do, right? Then it becomes very easy to assume that white folks are just superior, either biologically or maybe culturally and behaviorally, or they just make better choices, right? And women just don't want to be as successful, and they just aren't as fit for certain types of jobs and certain types of careers, and the poor of whatever race are obviously lazy. All of these become logical conclusions. So if you're taught that and you're not taught to interrogate it, it becomes really easy to fall into the trap. And the other thing that becomes easy is this. Think about what happens if you're told for hundreds of years, your group, the group from whence you come, is told for hundreds of years that that's true, that wherever you end up is all about you. And so you see white folks here disproportionately, overwhelmingly, see people of color down here. And then, after being told for hundreds of years that that's the way it's supposed to be, right? Because wherever you end up is all about you, so that's natural, that's normative, that's unquestioned. What happens when the people down here start making moves a little bit, right? Not even big moves, y'all, right? Black folks still twice as likely to be unemployed, 3 times as likely as white folks to be poor, 1/15 the net worth of white folks on average, but making moves a little bit, right? There's been some change, right? When all of a sudden the president's a black guy, and all of a sudden, the people on the posters and the children's walls in the bedroom, the icons of popular culture, might be black and brown. All of a sudden, we're listening to each other's music. Multiculture is the popular culture in a way it wasn't even just 25 years ago, 35 years ago. Some of us old enough in this room to remember MTV when it started. Well, first of all, we remember that MTV used to play music videos, y'all. That's a thing. But more importantly, we remember when they did not play black music videos. Right? Michael Jackson was the first they ever played. Then they played like one Prince song. They're like, yeah, we can't do that again for a couple years, right? They did not play black music. Now, popular culture is thoroughly intertwined, thoroughly multicultural. You got country artists that are making records with rap artists. What? Like, that doesn't even make sense 20 years ago. That doesn't even make sense 10 years ago, but that's happening now, right? And so popular culture has shifted, right? Folks down here making moves. Political culture has shifted. Black president, that making moves. All of a sudden, the demographics are shifting so that in 30 years, half the country is going to be people of color, half are going to be white, right? And so if you've always been told that this is what normal is, right? Whites up here, people of color down here, even if it's only here now, I mean, it's still, white folks still running stuff, right? But if there's been some narrowing of the gap, right, all of a sudden you start getting nervous because you were told that these people didn't really deserve that. So when they start to move up, they must be getting unfair preferential treatment. That's the only reason they'd make that progress. And we must be oppressed. All of a sudden, pluralism or equality even moves toward it, come to feel like oppression because you've been sucked into the trap of believing that the distribution was just and good and legitimate. So even good people can get sucked into that, right? Even good people can end up internalizing those messages because advertising works, doesn't it? Right? That's why the impulse purchasing thing I mentioned, it works. That's why companies take out those ads during the Super Bowl. They spend hundreds of millions of dollars to sell you stuff. They're not just blowing money because they got money to blow. They're trying to get you as many ads as possible so you'll buy their product. And the research says that if you see an ad for a consumer item like 12 times, it's the rule of 12 is what they call it. You see an ad 12 times, that's the point at which you are exponentially more likely to buy the product. Well, if I can make you buy a certain cell phone or a certain type of toilet paper or a certain tennis shoe or a certain toothpaste after 12 ads, don't you think it's possible that I can make you buy a racial stereotype, a gender stereotype, a class stereotype, a religious stereotype? Because you know what? You've seen that ad, metaphorically speaking, way more than 12 times. We've been seeing that ad all of our lives, and even good people can fall prey to it. So until we get clear on our history and until we are radically humble about our own conditioning And until we're willing to be radically humble about our own success, because see, that's part of it. The reason we want to believe that where we end up is all about us is it makes us feel better if we've been successful. And if we haven't been, we think if we just work a little harder, we'll get there. But we need to be humble enough to admit that where we are is not about us. This idea of rugged individualism is the most dangerous ideology on the planet. A, because it isn't true. B, because it justifies inequality and reinforces injustice. It's just not true, though. That's really the point. There's no such thing as a rugged individual. There's no such thing as an individual human being abstracted from their social context. Humans are social creatures by definition. None of y'all were raised on an island by a porpoise. Right? We all had people around us, a village around us, a tribe around us, a family around us. If y'all actually ever do come across someone who qualifies as a rugged individual, please promise me that you will run from that thing. Because that thing will be feral. That thing will not have language. That thing will never have been taught the taboo about not eating you because nobody would have taught it on the island where it was being raised, apparently, by the porpoise. There is no such thing as a rugged individual, right? We've all had help. Some of that help was about racial advantage and history. Some of it was about gender. Some of it was about socioeconomic head starts. Some of it was just luck. Right? I know we don't like to admit that. We don't like to admit luck because it's scary, right? When you admit that maybe you just had some luck, then if your luck is good right now, next Wednesday it could all go sideways, right? So I get it. It's frightening, but it's inarguable that there is such a thing and that we benefit from it, right? I'm a good example of this, and I would never ask you to contemplate this for yourself without demonstrating it myself. The only reason I'm here, I mean, my mama would tell you I talk real good, and that's why I'm here, and I guess whatever. I got like one skill in the world, and this is it. But that's not why I'm here. A lot of people talk real good, right? A lot of folks talk real good. A lot of folks write better than me. That's not why I'm here. I'm here because of a trajectory that I only had minor control over. It wasn't really about me. My very first job out of college was fighting a neo-Nazi white supremacist former Klan leader David Duke when he ran for U.S. Senate and then governor in Louisiana in 1990 and 91. And because I had that job, that was sort of a big deal. Nazi about to win a United States Senate race. So if you were involved in that campaign, you sort of got a little shine from the press, right? You got a little attention. Well, I was 21 years old. But I had this amazing job with this really high profile that catapulted me into the national spotlight and allowed me to get out here and do what I'm doing now. How did I have that job? I got it the old-fashioned way. I knew the two guys that started the organization whose purpose was to defeat David Duke. One was a history prof of mine. The other one was a graduate student and a friend of mine from Tulane, where I went to college, and they hired me right out of school. But why did I know them? The only reason I knew them was because I'd gone to Tulane, right? If I'd gone to any other college, I wouldn't have been in a position to even meet them, let alone get that job, fight David Duke, build up a reputation, get out on the lecture circuit, write 7 books on race. Why did I go to Tulane? Y'all, I went to Tulane because I was chasing a girl that was going to LSU. I mean, that's the truth. That's why I went there. There's no high-minded principle. I was chasing a girl who I had dated in high school who was going to Louisiana State University and convinced me that that was where I needed to go. I had never thought of going to Tulane. I was a high school debater. My girlfriend was also. She, however, was in Louisiana. I was in Tennessee. We met during a summer debate camp. I know, appropriately geeky. We met at a summer debate camp in Washington, D.C. at American University in the summer of 1985. I wasn't thinking about Tulane, never even had thought of Tulane. I was going to go to Emory in Atlanta. I knew the coach. She was recruiting me to debate there. I thought that was where I was going to go. Then I meet Monica, and Monica says, "Oh, you can't go to Emory. If you live in Atlanta, we'll never see each other." And I, in the manner of a foolish 16-year-old, said, "Of course, I will change my entire life trajectory for you, and I will go to Tulane." Now, as it all turned out, it did turn out, both for her and for me, not together, but it worked out for both of us separately. But the point is, if I don't meet Monica and she doesn't convince me to go to Tulane, I don't meet those men, I don't get that job, I don't build up that reputation, and I'm not doing what I'm doing today. Why, however, did I meet Monica? Only because I went to that debate camp, and only because I was indeed a debater, and the only reason I was a debater. Now, you may think that based on what I'm doing here tonight, that I came out of my mama's womb debating and arguing and speaking, but that would indeed not be true. When I was younger, this was not my skill set. I had a different one. I was a baseball player, and a really good baseball player. Now, I should say, as a side note, I was not as good a baseball player as Donald Trump, and I say that because y'all do know the story, right? Maybe you don't, but you're about to. Donald Trump wants you to know, he has said this on the record, that he was the best baseball player in the city of New York in 1962. which, for those of you who follow baseball, you will recognize as one of the many years that the Yankees won the World Series. But Donald Trump would have you know that he was better than Roger Maris. He was better than Mickey Mantle. He was better than Whitey Ford. He was better than Elston Howard or Phil Rizzuto or Yogi Berra if they were still playing. I don't know. But the point is, he was better than all of them, so I wasn't that good. But I was good enough that I had college recruiters coming to my Little League games when I was 11 years old, and I truly thought that that was going to be my path. But then something happened. I tried out for my high school team, and for whatever reason, nerves or I don't know, had a horrible, horrible tryout and got cut from the team. And so I had to find a different activity. If I make the baseball team, which by all rights I should have, given my history as a baseball player, I wouldn't have been a debater. I wouldn't have been at a debate camp during the summer. I'd have been playing more ball during the summer. But I had to find another activity. That was debate. That led me to American. That led me to Monica. She led me to Tulane. That led me to those men. That led me to that job. That led me to this career. That is not about me at all. That is about a series of serendipitous events over which I had no control, and me acknowledging that doesn't take away whatever skill set I have today doing what I do, but me telling you that is to model the kind of radical humility that we have to have if we're going to create equity and justice, because if we keep holding on to the idea that we've earned everything that we have by God, and we don't want to share it with anyone because we think it's all about us, we'll never build a society of plenty for everyone. We'll never build a society of justice and equity because we'll be fighting over the scraps of a pie to which we feel entitled and that we feel others are not entitled to the same. We don't need to make America great again. We need to make America great for the first time, and we will only do that on the basis of truth and humility and honesty. Thank you all so very much for being here. I appreciate you. Thank you. Thank you. You bet.
Awesome.
Got my phone from you.
Oh no, you're totally good. Awesome. Can we give it up for him one more time, everyone? We're gonna do a small transition real quick. Great. Thank you. So we're going to do a little transition right now. Like I said earlier, everyone has a note card on the seat before they came in. Please feel free to write a question, and there is a question box in the back, right back there next to the camera guy. Please, someone go up there and put in a question so other people feel engaged to put in a question as well. And one other note, please leave your pencil because it's not mine on the seat, so I can give it back to the department. Thank you. I'm going to have Dr. Siegel introduce the faculty panel, who's going to introduce one question, and then the rest of the questions are going to come from y'all.
And am I supposed to stay up here? Do we know? Or I just...
Do you want to have a chair?
Well, they told me there were 4 people who were going to need chairs.
Okay.
So I'm just going to hang out.
Okay, sounds great.
Unless it's creepy. Maybe it's creepy. Maybe
Why don't you
I'm
take
feeling a little Trumpish right now.
Why don't you take the 4th chair for now, and then come
I'll
on
do
up.
that because that's a lot less creepy.
That sounds great. All right, so as you're writing questions, I am going to invite the faculty panel to come up. And what we'd like to do is just take a minute and respond to Tim Weiss, and as you're writing your questions. So think about what question you'd like to ask and bring it to the back. And please come on forward. So joining us today, we have Dr. Brian Bantam, and he is the co-director with me for the Social Justice and Cultural Study major, professor of theology. Dr. Carlene Brown, professor of music, and also the chair of the music therapy program. And then Dr. Kevin Newhauser is the co-chair of sociology and professor of sociology. They also have a great new criminal justice program. So I just thought to start out, I would love to hear from you three. As you listen to the conversation, why does this topic matter to you? Or why is it important at Seattle Pacific University? Or what steps might we take now that we have heard this lecture?
Well, first, I want to thank. Good? No, I don't think he's doing anything, but it looks good.
Press the gold power button.
Gold power button? There is no gold power button.
Press the power button.
Oh, press it. Ah. Okay. Hello? Okay.
Yes.
What was really confusing was the power button was also said mute, so a little confusing. So I just want to thank Tim for his engagement and hilarity. But I think one of the things that I was wondering about, and I think it matters a lot here, and I kind of have two thoughts, and I'll see if I can merge them together. One is, what if part of the lie, part of the power of the lie is that it actually doesn't need to use whiteness in order to be effective? So in the condition, in the space of SPU, what if we don't actually talk about whiteness? What if we talk about Christian identity? And what if that becomes the cipher through which actually this kind of self-determination gets worked out, allows us to maintain a certain semblance of white supremacy, but under the auspices of what it means to be a quote-unquote Christian university? So I think that's one question, why this matters, why we need to interrogate history, why we need to think about, open up ourselves to the possibility that actually Christianity was not birthed in Europe, that Christianities are actually a vital thing that is in self embedded with diversity, many different ways of loving Jesus, many different ways of imagining, can be powerfully inclusive. And what would it mean to embrace that profoundly inclusive sense of Christian life following Jesus, and perhaps give up a certain white supremacist notion of that? So that's one part. Yeah, I have two, right? That was probably enough, but. The second part, though, and here I'm kind of curious to hear from Tim. Like, you provide a really compelling case. It's like, it's obvious, right? It's rational.
I say that a lot.
Like, it works. But part of me wonders, though, the analogy that I sometimes think of is, you tell an alcoholic, look, your behavior is destroying people, right? Look at the car that you wrapped around the tree. Look at the family that you left. Like, you're living on the street now, right? Rationally, you should take care of this problem, right? But for some reason, they don't. And I think to some extent that's part of the challenge for us, is we have to ask ourselves, what is this kind of this thing that maintains and allows white folk to be addicted to a certain sense of self-determination, that they react to black and dark flourishing with such fear. And I think in some ways the thing that's just been so traumatizing about the last 2 years, I feel like I'm trapped on a bus with my drunk uncle. And he's just barreling down the highway. And I try to tell people, drunk uncle is driving and he's drunk. We need to stop. And they're like, y'all, he's not that bad. And I'm like, what kind of crazy universe are we in right now? That in some ways the guy who's driving is obviously worse, but I'm more freaked out about the people that are defending him. And so I guess I'm wondering, like, how do we make sense of that? Like, I don't know what to do anymore, other than gather people who want to be for one another and foster a certain sense of life, and hopefully we can make our numbers so big we root out the evil in some form or fashion. But I don't know, and I wonder about that notion of rationality of the argument.
I'll speak to that in a minute, but
Yeah.
I want to hear from other people.
Sounds great. You want to go ahead?
Am I next?
Yes.
Well, thank you, Tim, for that very incisive analysis of the fear that drives American politics. If I hadn't read your book, White Like Me, and knew a little bit about your life, I would be convinced that you had a PhD in sociology, which is pretty much the highest praise that I can give anyone. So,
Because my undergrad is not even in sociology. So
no, no.
take your PhD.
I was like, well, if I had the power to give you an honorary PhD, it would be yours. But you're welcome to take my place in graduation. I'm glad that you primed them to laugh at almost anything that's said. That's good. As I said, your analysis of where the fear comes from was powerful. But as I was listening, I kept thinking about, well, fear is a powerful motivator. It gives purpose and meaning to life. And something has to replace fear. That it can't just be driven out and leave a vacuum. Something else will fill it. And at the very end, you mentioned 3 virtues of truth, humility, and honesty. But as I was listening, I just kept coming back to the verse in 1 John 4, in which the author says, there is no fear in love. That the opposite of fear is not courage. The opposite of fear is love. And as Christians, we are not called to love our families. That is not what we're called to. Jesus is very clear. He says, the Gentiles do that. The people who don't know God love their families. Everybody knows how to love the people like them. Everybody does that. There's no virtue in that. The virtue is in loving the person farthest from you, the person least like you. It's in loving your enemy. It's in loving the one who does not look like you. And at a Christian university, if what we want to do is engage the culture and change the world, somehow we have to learn together how to love rather than fear. We have to learn how to cross those boundaries. Dr. Perkins talks about relocation, the willingness not to build a wall, but to move next door. I don't know how we do it otherwise. But that is, it may take courage to love, but courage in and of itself is not the opposite of fear. It's love. And again, if you have any insights to how to get us to that, it would be deeply appreciated.
So thank you, Tim. I appreciated hearing you. I sat in this chair the entire time thinking, what am I doing here? And would rather not be here. Kimberly is one of my favorite people on this campus, and she's a close friend. And when she must have saw my face when I got here, and she says, this is going to be fun. This is not fun for me. This is deeply personal. So for some of you, it's an intellectual exercise and a curiosity. It's another to live it. And my husband, before I left the house, I'll be transparent, Tim. He says, don't be angry. Because what's the #1 stereotype of black women, right? We're angry. So keep the smile on. Told you I would. I really don't care. It's Friday night. It's been a long week. The reality of what this looks like, closing in this gap, is that there is a palpable, constant hostility toward me and mine that many of you don't see. It can be subtle, but the overtness within the last couple of years is unbelievable. I go to a store yesterday, going home, and I'm about to park. I'm trying to find parking. It's a Safeway. And I see a woman about to step onto a crosswalk, but there's enough distance, and I'm trying to be very careful. And it was daylight. And I circle around, and I still see this woman standing, like she was confused about where her car was or whatever. She's watching me, and I'm now watching her. And I park, and I don't get out of the car, and I'm thinking, does she need help? I'm trying to assess it, and she walks toward my car, and I pull the window down, and she goes on me. Did I not see her begin to walk across? I mean, the hostility. I was shocked by the moment. Now, I know how tall I am, and if I got out of that car, guess who's going to get in trouble, right? The restraint, the constant restraint. But the level of hostility is real. It is overt. I should be excited that my baby girl is going to have our first grandchild, and you would think that's a big deal. It is a big deal. Yep, we're happy. I did not know the statistics of Black women dying in childbirth. I did not know that number until recent. And so my daughter wants me with her, not just to witness the birth of my first grandchild, but to be that other eye to make sure she gets out of this alive. Who thinks that way? I have to think that way. You all don't have to. A lot of you don't have to think that way, but there's enough people of color here that you know what I'm talking about. This is understood, this way of dealing with y'all's fear and hostility and the energy that it takes. So my concern, because I worry about my family every time they leave the house, is what's it gonna cost us for y'all to get it?
So I'm going to try to sort of talk a little bit about all three of the things that were said, because there's some common threads that I think I can weave together through that. The thing about fear, right, that is so debilitating and which makes its opposite, love, necessary and justice necessary, is we know from the brain research, right, that neuroscience is telling us that when people are afraid, particularly when they have a fear of death, when they have a fear of their own mortality, which we sort of tend to have, right? It's a human thing, that we tend to not only not always think rationally, but we in fact are more likely to endorse reactionary, ultra right-wing politics because that seems strong and purposeful, right, and not weak and mushy the way that sometimes liberalism is viewed to be. So that fear is not just, is it like shut down your brain a lot of times, it shuts down that part of your brain that's rational and exercises executive function, but it also leads to, let's build a wall, let's do this, let's get more cops, let's get a bunch of guns, and so if we want to move to a society of justice, we are going to have to figure out a way to reduce fear. I mean, I used to think that we could just shift the fear like from one thing to another, right? And say, well, you're afraid of the wrong stuff. You should be afraid, but not of that. Let's make you afraid of this other stuff. And although that's intellectually satisfying, fear, nonetheless, tends to not lead people to progressive, love-filled solutions. So we do have to figure out a way to move through it. And the love piece, though, let me say this, because this also goes to your point about how we get there, or your question about how we get there. It's not just loving the stranger, though that is the virtue piece, as you mentioned. There's no virtue in loving family or those that are closest to you, per se. But one of the things that I think allows that alcoholic, whether it's your uncle who's driving the bus, God forbid, or whether it's just somebody in our lives that is killing themselves with alcohol or narcotics or whatever it might be, it isn't just a matter of them not loving others. They don't truly love themselves. I mean, I started therapy back in July. My therapist told me it was good to talk about this, so I'll mention it. And it's fantastic. You know what's great about therapy? Therapy allows you to figure out why you do the messed up stuff you do, right? And one of the reasons that you do the messed up stuff you do, whether that's substance abuse or whether that's rage or whether that's just whatever it is, right, that we go to get help for, you do it because at some point you don't think you deserve better, right? You don't truly love yourself. You think that you're not worthy of love. You think that you're not worthy of compassion. You think you're not worthy of being healthy. You think you're not worthy of whatever, right? And so the only way, I think, for example, when we think about white America today, part of our problem, and this is maybe one way that we can get to a place where we stop defending this system that costs you so much, right? And we stop supporting and maintaining a system that costs you so much, is that when we start to realize what it is costing us too, right? it becomes pretty profound. Right now, and it's not to say it's costing anywhere near as much as it costs people of color, but if we look at white America right now and we see this opioid crisis, just as an example, right? 500,000 excess deaths from 1999 to 2013, above and beyond what would have otherwise been predicted among white, middle-aged, non-college educated, working class white people, right? So mid-50s, mid-40s to mid-50s, non-college educated, working class whites. 500,000 excess deaths, disproportionately from what? Heavy drinking, which causes cirrhosis, suicide, just straight up suicide, usually when it's white men, it's a gun, or opioids, slow death, slow suicide, right? Now, why would this group be the one that has this huge surge in self-inflicted death? What is that? Because they tried to make it about economics, right? So you'd hear the media would say, these are deaths of despair. These people are in despair because the jobs have left and they don't have enough money. And okay, I get that. Like, that's real, right? But you know who also is suffering because of job loss and lack of money? People of color. And in fact, every objective indicator of economic well-being says as bad off as those white folks are, black and brown folks are actually worse off. So if it were just about despair, we ought to see those deaths spiking among all lower income and struggling working class people, and they're not. So what is it about white folks who are non-college educated, middle-aged, working class that is causing us in that group to do this, to end our lives immediately or over a period of time with self-abuse? Only one thing I can think of, right? We actually believed the lie that black and brown folks always realized was a lie. And that is the lie that says if you're just willing to work hard, you can make it. If you have a strong back and you're willing to lift stuff, there will be a job for you. See, people of color never took that for granted, right? Couldn't. But white men could. White men actually could say to themselves, you know what, my daddy worked in the mine, and I'm working in the mine, I'm gonna get my son a job in the mine, by God. Or we worked in the factory for 3 generations, and my kid's gonna join the union and get a job. And that's all fine and good until the economy globalizes and the plants close down and they move overseas, right? And now you're not prepared for the shift. See, people of color always knew they had to be on the grind and hustle to try to find the next thing because they couldn't take anything for granted. White folks could. So when you're told you're gonna get a 7 or better on a scale of 1 to 10, and now you're only at a 5.5 and you're 55 years old, looking down the barrel of retirement, you don't have enough money, you don't know where to put the pain. So you take it out on yourself, right? And you end your life either immediately or over time with this self-inflicted wound. See, that love that we lack, it isn't just a love for black and brown folks, though that is profound, right? It is also a lack of belief that we deserve love ourselves, and so we will take it upon ourselves to destroy ourselves in the name of this lie that we bought into. When those expectations that we alone were able to nurture and had nurtured by the culture go unfulfilled, we don't know what to do with it. And so I think if we would start to come to realize that this system was a setup, it was a setup for us. It made us all these promises that usually are fulfilled, but when things start to change and they're not, man, look out, right? And I think if we'd start to understand that, it would allow us to see the commonality of interest we have in ending the pain that people of color experience, because even though our pain is not as quantitatively great, it comes from a common source. There's a common source of the damage. The source is a system of white supremacy and a mentality of white supremacy that is intended to destroy the black and brown, but ironically makes us the collateral damage of our own success. Makes us the collateral damage of our own system. And if we understood that and we learned to love ourselves enough to say that we deserve better, we deserve a functioning system. My 17 and 15-year-old daughters deserve an economy that works for everyone, right? They deserve a society that cares and nurtures all children. And they'll never have that society as long as the society continues to damage black and brown people, right? Because that pain will come back around. So we have to, it'd be nice for us to operate because it's the right thing to do and fight racism and white supremacy out of altruism and the goodness of our hearts. But come on, y'all. Why do people of color fight white supremacy? It's not an altruism, it's to survive. It's so they don't die. Why do we act like we got to have more high-minded motives? You know, it's almost like we're saying to people of color, oh yeah, y'all can fight that thing for you, but we'll also fight it for you because we're just such good people and we're just going to help you with your thing. Right? As opposed to saying, no, we're all fighting systems of oppression and injustice because they can kill us, whether it's immediately or whether it's over time. It doesn't have to be about altruism, and certainly doesn't have to be about charity. It has to be about solidarity. It's self-help, right? It's about saying we all deserve better than this. And the reality is, ironically, I'm not sure white people believe that even about us. because of the way that we're treating ourselves now so as to maintain this addiction. So I don't know if that helps, but I think it's important to understand the opioid addiction crisis and all of these things as crises of late-stage whiteness, and the things that we've done to others come back on us, right? And I think we're seeing that with a vengeance right now. Yeah.
I also have some student questions, if I could ask those. One question is, how do we have conversations with family members and friends who believe what the president says? They are caught in his fear.
Anybody else want to take that? And I'll do it. I mean, I got something, but I'm just saying, I'd love to hear what other people. This time I think. It's not mine either, but well, I'll take a stab at it. So I got this question very similar last Thanksgiving, right before Thanksgiving. I was speaking at a college in Colorado, and the only question people had was like, "Oh my God, I'm going home for Thanksgiving. It's gonna be awful because my racist uncle." It's always a racist uncle, by the way. I don't know if you noticed that. It's never anybody's racist father. It's apparently just the childless brother of your father who's coming to dinner and is going to make life miserable for everyone. They said, I got this racist uncle. He's going to come, and he's been watching Hannity and been reading Breitbart, and he's been on Facebook, you know, getting all kinds of stuff from people, you know, and he's going to want to share it. What do we do? I said, well, first, let's start with what you don't do. First thing you don't do is you don't crack out your Intersectional Feminist 101 textbook. Not because that's not good stuff. It is good stuff. Your racist uncle ain't ready for that. So you can't start with that, because no 50-year-old man wants an 18 or 19-year-old college student to tell him how stupid he is. That just never goes well, right? And so you're going to have to start with something much more basic. And I said, here's what I would recommend. When you're dealing with people who are really dug in a position that you find problematic and that you want to challenge, I think it always helps to do a couple things. Number one, practice that radical humility that I mentioned a second ago. What does that mean? Well, it means that you can't get real haughty about how much you know, right? When the fact is, there was a time you didn't know it either, right? So when you get all uppity about the fact that, like, well, Uncle, you're an idiot, and it's Friday, and you literally just learned this stuff like Tuesday, you know, figuratively speaking, maybe even literally. Like, what? You can't do that. Like, you have to be humble enough to remember, well, there was a time when you didn't know what you know now. What helped you get there? It probably wasn't someone coming up and going, do you know how stupid you are? It is fascinating to me what an idiot you are. And I think you should stop being an idiot. Has that ever worked for anyone? Has anyone ever just like, you're an idiot? You go, oh my God, I'm an idiot. You're absolutely right. No one responds to that, right? So humility and trying to remember what got you there, and then practice that. The second thing, ask questions, right? See, I'm fascinated not by what people think necessarily, but why they think it, right? Because let's be honest, and this is also part of radical humility, none of us in here are objective about our politics. None of us. Not me, not you, none of us. Doesn't matter whether I agree with your politics or not. We're none of us, left, right, center, whatever you are. We all engage in selection bias in terms of the news we look at, the information we believe, the stuff we don't even look at, the books we never read, the media we do or don't consume. We all do it. We engage in what's called epistemic closure, so we get our little worldview and then we close it off to everything that doesn't comport with it. We all do this to some degree. Even people that are trying to be really objective and read like everything in their field because they're getting a PhD in that field, you still haven't read everything. You still haven't, read every study, looked at every piece of data, read every historical assessment. So we're all sort of picking and choosing. The question is why? Why is it that you and I, for instance, could look at the same facts and come to totally different conclusions? Well, it's not because either one of us is an idiot necessarily. Certainly not me. But what it is that certain things in our life, right? Certain experiences we've had, maybe the way we were raised, certain people to whom we have been exposed, who have opened our minds to certain things, who maybe other people just haven't been exposed to, will lead us to see something that they won't see, and vice versa. Oh, and you know what's even scarier? It's actually partly brain science as well, and it's biological. Like, actually, there is some research that there are some biological predispositions to certain political beliefs. Now, that's sort of frightening in a way, right? Doesn't mean that biology is destiny. Doesn't mean that you're born conservative or born liberal. I mean, obviously, it's both the nature and nurture thing, but it's at least partly hardwired in us. And so if you have a hardwired sort of predisposition to maybe lean one way or the other because of just the way that you are, your makeup, and something in your life also steers you in that direction, you might go in that direction. So that part of that is asking your uncle or your friend or whoever it is, like, hey, tell me a little bit more about why you think what you think. Don't tell me what you think. We're not going to debate. We're not here to have an argument or to have a debate. That's not productive. Usually, whether it's Thanksgiving or any day, like, you don't want to debate. It's just not. I used to do debates, and like I said, I was a competitive debater. And then when I started doing this, I would debate conservatives about all kinds of things around the country. And I just got to the point where I'm like, this is not helping. Like, they bring their squad, I bring my squad. Nobody changes their mind. It's all about who gets the most applause lines, and it's just sort of a silly exercise. But finding out why somebody thinks something, tell me why that piece of information you find so compelling, and I'll tell you why I find this other stuff compelling. At the very least, what happens when you ask that person a question about why they think what they think, a couple things happen. Number one, you're showing respect for them, right? You're demonstrating compassion and respect and showing interest in them, which in and of itself is a nice thing to do, and it de-stresses the situation. It brings the temperature down a little bit, because you'd like, tell me a little bit more about that. If I didn't care about you, I wouldn't even ask you that question. I wouldn't even bother. I'd just be like, you're an idiot, I'm moving on, right? Second thing it does is it calls for reciprocity. If I ask you why you think what you think, unless you're a real jerk, you're probably going to ask me in a reciprocal manner to explain why I think what I think. Or at least if you don't ask me, I can offer it to you and say, well, let me tell you a little bit about why I think what I... And at the end, you know what? You probably don't change that person's mind and they don't change yours. But you know what does happen? The tensions come down a little bit, and that's where love can enter, because we can be kind with one another, right? And it's harder to do that when you're not being... But if I can be kind with you... I've got a guy I've been talking to for 12 years via email. I call him my Nazi pen pal. I don't recommend you get one of these necessarily, but I got one. And I didn't mean to have one. It just sort of happened. Like, this guy wrote to me one day, years ago, yelling at me. And when I say Nazi, like, I'm not using that word flippantly. Like, I mean actually like a real National Socialist who, when you call him a Nazi, he's like, yeah, pretty much. This guy writes me this horribly angry email, but he caught me on a good day. It was on a Friday, and I was sort of in a good mood, and he writes to me screaming at me about Jew this, Jew that, blah, 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 get in the oven, blah, 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 all this really nice stuff. And I wrote him back, and I said, Rob, it seems to me you're having sort of a rough day. I understand. I've had those. Tell you what, do me a favor. Let's wait a couple days. Call me or email me back. Don't call me. God, no, don't do that. Email me on Sunday or Monday when you've had a chance to think about it. And if you want to have a conversation about this thing that you're mad at me about, then maybe we'll try that. Or not, but whatever. Have a good weekend. And this was like a social experiment for me. I was just feeling real ecumenical and thought I'd give it a shot. So I didn't know what was going to happen, but here's what I did know. Either he's going to write back and go, Jew, get in the oven, and then we're just going to be done. Like, I'm going to stop the conversation, and I know I tried, and I feel better, and we're done. Or he's going to ignore me, right? In which case, fine, we're done. Okay, I tried, but we're done. Or maybe he'll reach out and be kind. And you know what? A couple days later, he writes back, he apologizes for his tone, and we start writing. And now he sends me like yoga tips and stuff, and like videos of him standing on an exercise ball for balance. It's weird, but it's not dangerous, right? Now, is he still a white nationalist? Yes, he is. He is still a white nationalist. Is he as dangerous as he was when we started? Absolutely not. He is no longer affiliated with an actual active organization. He doesn't blog the way he used to. He has stepped back from some of the organized activity. Does he still have views that I find reprehensible? Absolutely. But I guarantee you he is less dangerous today. And in part, that was because I was willing to sort of take the step of being compassionate. Now, having said that, that is not for black and brown folks to have to do. That's white folks' work. Black and brown folks do not need to suffer fools gladly. Get y'all Nazi pen pals, talk to Nazis or any white person you don't want to talk to. That is our job. Those are our people. We have to come for our people, right? And that doesn't mean that we go and try to save them all, because sometimes they're not. I think we ought not probably spend a lot of time trying to save Nazis, right? We got a lot of other white folks to deal with who are not Nazis who we still got to work with. But what I'm trying to use that example for is just to show that when you do come at somebody with a certain degree of compassion and a recognition that, of course, they're damaged. They were intended to be damaged. This system set them up to be damaged. It is predictable that they are damaged, and we are too, right? Then I think it becomes easier to reach them and meet them where they are and maybe have some breakthroughs or not, but at least make it less stressful. And then your blood pressure is lower, and then you're healthier, and then you can love the people who are ready to receive your love, even if they're not, right?
Thank you. And just let's do one more question. There's an emphasis in your speech on historical accuracy.
Yeah.
How can we promote this across the country, especially knowing the current conditions or the American education system?
Does anyone want to take a shot before I just feel like I'm just talking a lot, so. Okay. All right, well, if you change your mind, let me know. So obviously history education is not, there's not a real high premium placed on it in K-12, and it's unfortunate. And in fact, it always bothers me when you see this push for STEM, and look, I get it, like I understand STEM's very important, don't get me wrong. But I feel like the thing we miss when we push people to go into STEM fields is that we can have all the science and technology and engineering and math folks in the world, but if we don't understand history and we don't understand our culture and both the good and the bad of it, then we're gonna be doing really great science, really great tech, really great engineering, and really great math in a fundamentally hostile, undemocratic, maybe even authoritarian, you can have really good technology in an authoritarian society. You can have really good math and science in an incredibly authoritarian, unfree society. So we gotta also emphasize history. You know what the problem is? Right now, you ask most high school students, what's your least favorite class? Most people say history. Now, I would never have said that because I was a history geek and that was sort of my thing, right? But most people hate it. You know why they hate it? Because they don't understand the relevance to the current day because we don't teach it. Most teachers, some do. Some of y'all might have had some fabulous history teachers, but most of us did not, because what was history? When we learned it in school, it was dates and it was names and it was battles and it was like, Articles of Confederation, give me one sentence. Okay, there it is. And the battle of Gettysburg, and then it's one sentence or whatever. And it's sort of, it's just abstract. It doesn't have clear meaning, and so people think it's just something they've got to learn for some reason they don't understand. So we've got to teach it in a much more thematic way that is not just about rote memorization and linear, because see, the problem with linear history, this is the biggest issue, we teach it linearly. Linearly, that means in this sense that we start off with, oh, things were really bad. Oh my God, things were really bad. But then some good people got together and they fixed those things, and it's always getting better. Things are always getting better, onward and upward, things are always getting better. But that's not actually how history happens. Things are not always getting better. There's 2 steps forward, 1 step back, 3 steps forward, 5 steps back. But if we don't know that, what happens? We get people who say things like, I'm talking about young people now, some of y'all in this room, in your generation, who will say things like, I sound like a cranky old middle-aged man right now, but for real, but we said the same thing. So every generation has said this. Well, this is y'all's problem from your generation. This is what young people say. This is our parents and our grandparents' problem. We're going to solve this. This isn't really a big deal anymore. Now, most young people of color don't say that, though some do. Some do. Some fall into that trap. But a lot of young white folks are like, come on. We don't, because we all got black friends and we got dream catchers in our rearview mirror and we think that makes us indigenous and, right? And so we've got all these connections to people that we think get us out of the racism problem, which, by the way, like as a side note, the fact that you have black friends, if you really think that gets you out of the potentiality of racism, or that you dated an Asian woman once, or that you have that dream, because here's why it doesn't make sense to me. Heterosexual men, we date and marry women, but I'm fairly confident we can still be sexist. Maybe I'm wrong, right? But I think if a straight man were to say, well, I can't be sexist, I have a wife, we would all realize that is truly the dumbest argument that would ever be made, but it is functionally the exact equivalent of, I can't be racist because I have black friends. So I don't know why I even brought that up, but here's the thing. It's strangely applied, but here's the thing. When you teach history linearly as this never-ending thing of progress, it becomes easy to think that, well, it'll just sort of take care of itself. That's where I was going, right? It's like it'll age out. right? Because the generations will come and will fix it and things are getting better. And yeah, it's true. Humans are actually getting better in a lot of ways. Like the world is less violent today than it's ever been in history, right? Even though we might be more aware of it because we have media that makes us more aware of it. But like literally not that long ago in human history, like raping and pillaging villages was like, that was just happening every day. Now it still happens far too often, but literally the net amount of violence in this world is less. So we're getting better at some things, but it's not just happening on its own. It's happening because people are making it happen, right? That people are standing up and fighting for a different world. It's not just because the clock is moving. It's not just because the pages on the calendar turn, right? It's because we've done things. And so you think about American history, like if I were to say to you, who's the first professional baseball player in this country who was black, 99.99% of the people who have an answer at all are going to say, what, Jackie Robinson, because that's what we've been told. That's not accurate. Jackie Robinson was not the first professional baseball player in the United States in the quote-unquote major leagues. There were black baseball players in the major leagues in the 1890s whose names you don't even know, who were run out of the game by racist white ball players who didn't want to play against them. And then it took another 50 years for black folks to be allowed back on the diamond in the major leagues. 6 of the first 10 or 12 jockeys that won the Kentucky Derby were black jockeys. Then they were run out of horse racing. So it's 2 steps forward, 3 steps back. And we need to know that so that we keep doing the work and don't just assume that the passage of time will do it. So we got to teach history differently, which means we got to train teachers differently, because you can't teach what you don't know, and you can't teach in a way that you haven't been taught how to teach. Most teachers teach the way they were taught, right? And so if you're teaching history, you could be a really knowledgeable historian in a way, but if you don't have the pedagogical training about how to make that come alive for people, right, it's not going to make any difference. And it's not just history, by the way. Science, I think, go back to STEM for a second. There's a way to connect these. Like, these aren't really disparate things. We make them separate, but they're really not. So like if you think about science, sometimes we think that, well, that's like science is objective fact and history and sociology are subjective and da-da-da-da-da-da. Science is not objective. It's not remotely objective. Science was used for generations and still is all around the world and could be again tomorrow, any day, to justify genocide. It was used to justify sterilization and eugenics, right? The Nazis actually got their ideas, eugenic ideas, from American scientists who worked at Princeton and worked at Stanford and worked at Yale and worked at Harvard, right? They actually copied our ideas about racial hygiene and racial science. That's not stuff the Germans came up with. We did that, and they stole those ideas from us. And so this is but if I'm in a science classroom and I don't know, like let's say if I'm a person of color and I don't know how science has been used against my people, right? It might be hard for me to understand, why are you making me learn this? Like, I'm just trying to survive, right, in a society that's harshing on me every day. So why do I need to learn this stuff? Just to pass some test that you think I got to learn? But if I knew that, like, no, you got to learn this because this will be weaponized against you. Like, this will straight be used to destroy you. So your knowledge about science is self-defense. It's a way for you to flip that and not allow it to be used against you. Now it has a social meaning. So now you want to get black and brown folks excited about STEM. You don't just dangle like, oh, here's a job that you can get if you do this and get a PhD in this and get a da-da-da-da-da. That's fine. But the bigger thing is, like, let's connect it to the day-to-day lived experience of black and brown people, right? Because that's going to, I mean, that would just, I would think, that would be a far better way to connect the dots between history and science. And, there was a teacher in Denver a couple years ago in Cherry Creek, suburb of Denver, that did this with math. White teacher had a 9th grade classroom. The black kids in the class, particularly the black males, were not doing well in the math class, even though he knew they were bright. He talked to them in the halls. He knew they were smart kids, but they just weren't trying. They weren't turning in homework. They were slacked in the chair. They had earbuds in when they should have been listening. They just didn't try as far as he could tell, but he knew they were bright. And one day he decided to go up to the board and start writing stuff. He starts writing all these tables and graphs and charts, statistics and data, but he didn't label any of it, so he didn't tell them what it was. And at the end of the 15 minutes, he's filled up the whole board, and the students are like, what is that? Is that going to be on the test? Man, that's horrible. Like, we don't know what any of that is. And he's like, that is evidence that somebody's trying to kill you. And they were like, what are you talking about? He goes, well, and he goes over and he tells them what it is. He goes, this is the data on incarceration rates for blacks versus Hispanics versus whites in the greater Denver area. This is the stop and frisk and racial profiling data. This is the housing value. This is the infant mortality data. This is the life expectancy data. In other words, it was the algebra of inequality, right? The calculus of oppression that he's putting up there. And he's saying, now, here's the thing. There are people out there more than willing to make you one of these numbers. They really don't care. What are we going to do? Are we going to blow these numbers up, or you want to become one of them? Because whatever you want to do, I guess we can do. Now, the thing was, this white man, he did not, and let me be clear, he's not the hero in this story. This white man did not tell these kids anything they didn't know, right? They lived this reality. They know what he's putting up there. They didn't necessarily know the numbers, but like they know the story behind the numbers because they live it every day. But they never had someone in a position of authority look them dead in the eye and say, yeah, you know that thing you think is happening? Yeah, that's actually happening. And I just want to ratify that for you so you know, like, I know the deal too. Because once a person in a position of authority ratifies your truth in a society that's trying to make you think you've lost your mind, because white supremacy is crazy making, right? It is about making people of color doubt their own experience. It is about making people of color doubt their own reality and need white people to sell it back to them, right? And so when this white man stands up and says, no, y'all are right the whole time, like this is really happening, and here's a little bit of more evidence, then all of a sudden these young black men in this class got a fire lit under them. They were, because now they understood math, numbers, statistics, data wasn't just some abstract thing that somebody was making them learn to pass a test, but it was stuff that like was the substance of their lives were boiled down to numbers and data and statistics and charts. And so these kids started taking it real seriously, understood the social importance of it, started tutoring 8th graders, created a mentoring group for young black kids in 8th grade called the Brotherhood, which scared some people because, they called it the Brotherhood. Folks were like, what is that? Is that a gang? It's a math gang. Yes, it's very frightening. And all of a sudden, these kids that were getting D's and F's were getting A's and B's, right? Because why? Because they understood now that it was not this abstraction. Like, it had relevance. So we have to teach material in a relevant way that connects it to people's lives, whether that's history, whether that's science, whether that's math, I think, or whatever it is.
Thank you. Let's give Tim Weiss and the panel a round of applause.